It was a late afternoon when I first noticed her standing by the fence, her hands busy with a small pot of flowers. I had seen her countless times before, Maggie, my neighbor. She lived next door in the little cottage that always looked so well kept, like a picture out of a cozy magazine. Every time I passed her house, I admired how the sunlight seemed to always cast just the right glow on her rose bushes, the ones that always bloomed in the spring, no matter what. I had never been particularly close to Maggie. We were neighbors, of course, and I'd exchanged pleasantries with her a few times over the years. But today was different. Something about the way she stood there, almost waiting, as if sensing my gaze from across the yard, made me pause. It was a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place where the cars drove by slower and the dogs barked at the same time every evening. So, when Maggie and I started to talk that day, it wasn't anything unusual on the surface. But the way she spoke, the way she looked at me as we shared those few words, left something deeper behind. I took a slow step toward the fence, wiping my hands on the sides of my pants, more from nervous habit than anything else. I had been working on the old garden shed, fixing the roof before the first rains came. As I approached, she looked up, her gray eyes meeting mine, soft but not shy. "Looks like you've been busy," she said, her voice warm, like the afternoon sun. I shrugged. "Trying to get ahead of the rain. You know how it is." She smiled, then glanced down at the pot in her hands, gently brushing the soil. "I've always admired how you keep this place in shape. You've been here long." "Long enough," I said, glancing around at the overgrown hedges and the weathered fence. "More than I care to admit." Her laugh was light and inviting, with a touch of something else, something familiar. Something that made me feel like I could share a little more than just casual chatter. I found myself leaning on the fence, the usual distance between neighbors shrinking just a bit. "How long have you been here?" I asked, realizing I didn't know much about her at all, except for the basics: her name, where she worked, or used to. I wasn't entirely sure, and the fact that she kept to herself mostly. She paused for a moment, then looked up at the sky, like she was reaching for the right words. "Oh, about 15 years now. It's funny how time seems to slip by when you don't pay attention." "I can relate," I said, feeling the weight of time myself. "Everything just seems to blur together after a while." There was a pause, a moment where the air around us felt thick. I wasn't sure what it was about her, about the way she stood there, so grounded, so unhurried, but something about the conversation made me open up in a way I hadn't expected. We talked for what felt like hours, about trivial things, weather, the garden, and how we both hadn't seen any new neighbors in years. But it wasn't the small talk that held my attention. It was the way Maggie listened. Really listened. Like she understood, not just my words, but something deeper. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, I found myself sitting on the edge of the garden wall, hands resting on my knees. Maggie was still standing, but she seemed comfortable in the moment too. We were two people in the same place, but it felt like we were also in our own little world. "You ever think about the past much?" she asked suddenly, looking at me through a side glance. Her question was unexpected, but not unwelcome. "I think about it more than I'd like to," I said, my voice quieter now. "I mean, not the stuff that makes you regret anything," she continued, now with a small smile. "I'm talking about the good stuff. The little moments that stand out. Like the smell of fresh cut grass in the morning, or a song you haven't heard in years but suddenly, it takes you back." I thought about that for a moment. It was an interesting question. One I hadn't thought to ask myself in a long time. "I suppose I do," I said, looking back at her. "It's funny how small things can bring back so many memories. Things you thought were long forgotten." She nodded, as if she knew exactly what I meant. "Sometimes, I think the past doesn't really leave us. It just kind of lingers. Like an old friend that shows up when you least expect it." There was something about the way she spoke, so calmly, so introspective, that made me feel like I could relax. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something that was slowly turning into a quiet exchange of experiences, of thoughts that didn't often find their way to the surface, and that's when I realized she wasn't just any neighbor. Maggie was someone who had seen life, like me, and had felt it. She wasn't talking about regrets or missed opportunities. She was talking about the kind of moments that gave life meaning, those little snippets that you hold on to, long after everything else fades. You're right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I think about the past a lot, but not always with regret. More like, I've lived it, you know. And I'm still here. Still learning. She smiled, her eyes softening. Isn't that what it's all about? Living it. Even when we don't always understand it. I smiled too, a little embarrassed, but also grateful for her words. The afternoon had turned into something more than I had expected, and somehow, I didn't want it to end. And then, just as the last light of the day faded and the sky darkened with the hint of evening, Maggie said something that made my heart pause. I think we spend too much time focusing on what's missing, instead of what's still here, she said, her voice gentle. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and I understood exactly what she meant. It wasn't about what we had lost or what we hadn't done. It was about the simple, quiet moments we still shared. The ones that had a quiet power all their own. The evening ended with her heading inside, her footsteps soft against the gravel driveway. As I watched her go, I felt something inside me stir, a quiet, subtle shift, as if the day had unlocked something in both of us. I hadn't expected any of this. But I was glad it had happened. The days following our conversation by the fence were a quiet kind of revelation. We continued to exchange pleasantries whenever we saw each other, but there was something different now. The air between us felt lighter, as though the brief interaction had peeled away layers that neither of us realized were there. I found myself looking out my kitchen window more often, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, Maggie. She was always out there in her garden, working with a kind of care that made you believe every petal, every leaf, was part of something much larger than just the task at hand. It was as if the garden was her sanctuary, and she tended to it as though each plant had its own personality. I admired that about her. One afternoon, when the temperature had taken a sudden dip and the wind carried a hint of winter, I saw her struggling to carry a large bag of mulch from her driveway to the garden. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and hurried outside. Need a hand with that? I called across the yard, already walking toward her. She paused, looking up with that same warm smile she always wore. Well, if you don't mind, she said, glancing at the bag in her hands. I've got more of this stuff than I thought. I walked over and took the bag from her hands before she could protest. It wasn't heavy, but it was awkward to carry. We walked in comfortable silence toward her garden, our footsteps soft on the grass, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Once the bag was safely on the ground near her roses, I took a step back and looked at her garden, really looked at it. The colors of the flowers had started to fade, but there was still something peaceful about the scene. You've done a good job here, I said, not sure exactly what I was trying to express. Maggie smiled at the compliment, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. It's nothing special. Just a hobby, she said, but there was a quiet pride in her voice. Sometimes, I feel like these plants are the only thing that doesn't change. They grow, they bloom, and then they fade away, just like everything else. There it was again, those thoughts she had, those moments of reflection that seemed to stretch beyond the simple conversation. It wasn't just about the garden, it was about life, about time. I know what you mean, I said slowly. It feels like everything changes, sometimes faster than we expect. I guess that's part of getting older, right? Maggie turned to face me, her gaze thoughtful. Maybe, she said, the lines around her eyes softening. But I think it's more about accepting that change is just another part of life. It doesn't have to be something to fear, you know. I nodded. I didn't really know how to respond. There was something so natural about the way Maggie accepted things, about the way she seemed to have this quiet wisdom that I had long since lost. Do you ever think about the future? She asked suddenly, almost as if she was testing the waters. I hadn't expected the question, but it was a good one. I stood there for a moment, my hands stuffed into the pockets of my jacket. The future, huh? I repeated, considering. I used to think a lot about it, back when I was younger. But now? I don't know. I guess I've come to realize that the future is just a series of moments. And those moments aren't always guaranteed, so I just try to enjoy what I have. Maggie studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small, approving smile. I think that's a good way to look at it, she said softly. I hadn't realized how much her approval meant until I heard her say those words. It was strange how someone you barely knew could make you feel like you were on the right path, just by the way they listened, by the way they understood without needing to say much at all. As the weeks went by, our interactions continued like this, small, casual moments that held a quiet depth. It became a routine of sorts. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward her house, wondering if she was out in the garden, or whether today would be the day she'd call me over for a cup of coffee, something she'd done a few times since our first conversation. It was one of those afternoons, just as the sun was beginning to set, that I found myself walking over to her house. I had been fixing some loose tiles on the roof of the shed again, another never-ending task, and thought I'd stop by and see if she was free. As I reached her door, I could hear the soft hum of music from inside, the kind of easy listening that you don't often hear anymore. I knocked lightly, waiting a moment before Maggie appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright and welcoming as always. Hey there, she greeted me. Come on in. I've just finished making some tea. You look like you could use a break. I smiled, grateful for her kindness. Tea sounds perfect, I said. She stepped aside to let me in, and I followed her down the narrow hallway to the small kitchen. There, on the table, was a steaming pot of tea, 2 cups already waiting. The kitchen was cozy, with warm light spilling from the overhead lamp, and the smell of cinnamon and herbs hung in the air. It was the kind of place you could easily lose yourself in for hours, just talking and listening. We sat down at the table, and Maggie poured the tea, her movements slow but deliberate. So, how's the shed coming along? She asked, looking up at me over the rim of her cup. Slowly, but I'm getting there, I replied, taking a sip of the tea. It was warm and soothing, the perfect antidote to the chill outside. You know, I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about accepting change. She raised an eyebrow. Oh. Yeah, I continued, I think I've been avoiding it for a long time. Focusing on things that, well, maybe I can't change anymore. But I guess that's not really living, is it? Maggie didn't say anything at first, just watched me with those kind eyes of hers. I think it's okay to be where you are, she said quietly. You don't have to rush ahead or chase after things that aren't there. It's okay to just be. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, the kind of peace that comes when someone truly understands what you've been carrying, even if it's never been said aloud. And for the first time in a long time, I realized she was right. The future would come, whether I was ready or not. But the here and now, this quiet moment shared between 2 people who understood each other's unspoken thoughts, that was something worth holding on to. As autumn slowly made its way toward winter, the days grew shorter, the nights colder, and yet, somehow, everything felt a little warmer. Our conversations had become more frequent, more meaningful, and each time we spoke, I felt that familiar sense of comfort with Maggie that I hadn't realized I was missing. There was something about those late afternoons that felt special, those quiet hours when the sun was setting, casting golden light across the yard, and the world outside seemed to slow down just for a while. It was during one of these moments, as we sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets and sipping tea, that I found myself reflecting on how far I had come since that first talk by the fence. Maggie had been telling me stories of her childhood, of the small town she grew up in, and of her late husband, a man she spoke of with great love but also with a quiet sadness that was impossible to miss. I was always struck by how she could talk about him so openly, as if their love was something that never really left her, even though he had been gone for years. Do you ever think about the people we've lost? She asked softly, her gaze drifting to the trees beyond her porch. The ones we loved. The question wasn't one I had been expecting, but it wasn't a surprise either. There was always this underlying current in our conversations, a gentle reminder that time is both fleeting and constant, that the people we hold dear are never truly gone, as long as we carry their memories with us. I think about them every day, I replied, my voice lower than usual. I guess that's what happens when you get older. You start to realize how much time you've had and how much you still want. But you also learn that holding on too tight isn't always the best way to keep those people with you. Maggie nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's a tricky balance, isn't it? Holding on and letting go. She took a deep breath, as though trying to find the right words, and I could see the weight of the years in her eyes. But sometimes, I think letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It just means making room for something new. Something different. I looked at her then, really looked at her. The way the setting sun painted her face in soft light, the way the breeze played with the strands of her silver hair, it all seemed to echo the truth of what she was saying. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold on to what was gone, not realizing that maybe, just maybe, I was missing the chance to create new memories, new connections. There was a quiet pause between us, a moment of reflection that stretched out before we both spoke at once. You know, I started, I didn't expect to find someone like you here. Someone who could make me think about things I hadn't in years. I've learned a lot just by talking to you. Maggie smiled, her eyes warm, but there was a softness to her smile that hinted at something deeper. I think I've learned a lot too, she said. About letting go, about being present. About finding joy in the little things. You know, sometimes we forget that we still have time. Time to enjoy what's right in front of us. And in that moment, I realized that everything she had said, every word, every glance, every subtle shift in her tone, had been leading up to this. She wasn't just teaching me how to accept the passage of time, she was showing me how to embrace it. To live in the moment. To appreciate the now. I sat there, with the warm mug of tea in my hands, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The past was behind me, and the future would come when it was ready. But the present was where I was, and with Maggie, I had found a new sense of clarity. I'm glad we've become friends, I said, my voice softer now. As the last light of day faded into the night, she looked at me, her gaze steady and kind. Me too, she said simply, and there was something in her voice that told me she knew exactly what I meant. For a long time after that, neither of us spoke. We just sat there together, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the yard, our shared silence saying everything words could not. In the weeks that followed, our bond grew even deeper. We found more ways to connect, whether through quiet moments on her porch or shared cups of tea in the kitchen. Maggie had become more than just a neighbor, she had become someone I could trust, someone who reminded me that it's never too late to rediscover yourself, to learn to let go, and to open your heart to new possibilities. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest lesson of all, that even in the quietest corners of our lives, there's room for love, for connection, and for growth. No matter how old we get, no matter how many years pass, there is always space for something new to bloom, like the flowers Maggie so carefully tended in her garden. The future may be uncertain, but the present, this moment, was a gift, and I was finally ready to embrace it.